welcome virtually to this session of the Housing Assistance Council's Rural Housing Symposium. We're glad that you can join us. I'm Ann Carpenter with the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta, and I'm joined by my friend and colleague, Karama Neal of Southern Bancorp Community Partners. Although I'm not in an armchair and Karama and I are hundreds of miles apart, we are going to structure this as rather an informal armchair discussion, really about affordable housing, rural issues, and particularly in the areas of the country that we serve, so the southern and southeastern United States. As I said, my name is Ann Carpenter, and I am an assistant vice president at the Atlanta Fed. We, in our Community and Economic Development Program, we seek to better understand issues that affect low and moderate income communities within our footprint, which is 6 southeastern states, and to highlight evidence-based solutions to work towards meeting the needs of our communities. I do need to give a Fed disclaimer, so these comments are my own and not those of the Federal Reserve System or the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta. And with that, I would like to introduce Karama. Dr. Karama Neal is president of Southern Bancorp Community Partners, which is a nonprofit community development loan fund focused on improving economic mobility for underserved people and places in the Mid-South. And they do this through financial development services, public policy and research, and development lending. Prior to joining SBCP in 2009, she was an adjunct professor and a program director at Emory University, where she earned a PhD in genetics. She also has an MA in bioethics and health policy from Loyola and a BA in biology from Swarthmore. She also serves on the Little Rock branch of the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis. So hello, Karama, welcome.
Thank you so much. It's a real pleasure to be here. Really appreciate this forum.
And you have such a unique background. I've long meant to ask you more about it, and I wanted to take this opportunity to kick off this conversation by asking you how your deep knowledge in healthcare and healthcare policy influences the work that you do today, and does it influence how you think about rural housing issues?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So again, thanks for this conversation. I started off in basic science, and that was sort of what I wanted to do at the time. I loved it. I did it for about 20 years. I think it really gave me a good sense of how to approach problems, how to uncover assumptions, how to really take, you talked about being evidence-based before, how to take an evidence-based sort of data-driven approach to problem solving. And so that has really served me well in the CDFI sector. It's served me well at Southern. It's been really nice to be able to apply those tools to particular kinds of problems that we see in development finance, but then also as we think about, how housing patterns, housing policy, those kinds of things. The other thing I'll just say is that, in the timing that I've spent in other places, it's been interesting to see what housing patterns look like and how different they can be, and what is considered luxury housing one place, that's a big, beautiful high rise somewhere in New York City. For someone else who's used to having a yard like I was growing up in Arkansas, that feels very different. And so I think really being attentive to what housing looks like is really critical. The other thing I'll say too, just real quickly, is that, when we look at some of the housing challenges that we face, particularly in rural parts of our country, some of the sanitation issues, those kinds of things, those directly align with public health issues. And so, thinking about health and wealth, health and housing are really, really critical things to think about together. And we see it's a wonderful book out called Waste recently that talks about some of these issues. So there's really a lot of work to do there.
Yeah, and you serve rural areas and the states of Arkansas and Mississippi. At the Atlanta Fed, we cover several southeastern states. We actually overlap on Mississippi, but kind of building on that, I wondered what kinds of conditions on the ground, what kinds of challenges that you're seeing in the markets that you serve today with rural housing.
Yeah, it can be a real challenge. It can also be a real opportunity. I mean, part of the things we see is that, housing is oftentimes fairly inexpensive in a lot of the areas where we work in particular. And so that can be a real boost, right? It's not unusual for someone to own their home, to have a home passed down, those kinds of things. Like home ownership is not, there are definitely folks who don't have that, but it is not oftentimes unattainable because the housing prices are relatively low. That said, housing quality can be a real issue for families. We just talked about, some of the sanitation issues that sometimes folks have, but also just, the quality of the structures, the quality of housing. Many of the places where Southern works are in communities where there has been out-migration and persistent poverty for 30, 40, 50 years. So when you have, a community that has had systemic poverty for that long, has had out-migration for that long, no one's coming in and building new, nice homes. It doesn't cash flow, at least at scale. Someone, obviously individually might do that, but at scale, that the money doesn't work in that regard. And so we're really thoughtful about how to help people access housing that is of decent quality, help them make those repairs or those improvements as is necessary. But that is a real issue, the quality of the housing. Also the quantity, particularly of affordable housing and of decent affordable housing is really also an issue as well. I think, because housing in rural areas are almost by definition less dense. There may not be as many options to choose from. You may not have as many vacant options, particularly at ones that, one would want to live in that you have to choose from that you might compare to a more urban, more dense kind of area. So that's an issue as well. We have a HUD certified housing counseling agency as well at our organization. So we're also very thoughtful about how to help people make good decisions about home ownership, about renting, about fair lending, all those kinds of things that are really critical for folks to have and feel comfortable with their housing decisions. And this is particularly important right now. We've seen a lot of conversation around eviction, particularly because of the economic impact of the pandemic. And that's an area where we're starting to delve into a little bit. I know you all have done some work on that as well.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up. Evictions getting a lot of deserved attention right now with the loss of income people are facing, with the moratoria on evictions that are expiring or set to expire soon. And I think a lot of the work, and I can speak to the work that we've been doing, has been on denser, more populated areas. And there's been a gap, frankly, in kind of the data and knowledge that we have about how evictions and displacement and rent debt will play out in rural areas. And I do think we need more quantitative and qualitative data to better understand what the scope is and what some of the impacts likely will be on families in rural areas. For one thing, there is less representation from the legal community in rural areas sometimes, and that's another issue that we should be really thinking about in terms of recourse that these families have. And another question I have then, going back to the challenges that you've just mentioned, is really how, and you mentioned one about being a HUD certified counseling organization, but what other roles does your CDFI play in addressing some of these housing challenges?
Yeah, I appreciate that question. We are obviously a mission-driven organization. We were founded about 30 years ago with a real intention around improving economic mobility. And so, and particularly around the issues of race, there was a lot of, when you go back and you read the original papers, you talk to the people who were originally founding Southern in the late 80s, that was a very clear part of their goal. And so when we go back and we look at that now and we say, okay, what is our purpose? Why are we here? What is the work that we are here to do? When we recognize this role of economic mobility, we look at the data and say, okay, what are the drivers of economic mobility? There's research that shows that net worth is a key driver of economic mobility. So people have higher net worth, they're able to take advantage of opportunities, they become more economically mobile. So when you go back another step, what are the drivers of net worth? And there are a number of things that are drivers of net worth: savings, having a good job, owning a business, a job that pays a living wage, those kinds of things. Home ownership and affordable housing are drivers of net worth. When someone buys a home, if that home appreciates in value, that can be a driver of net worth. Having the equity in the home can be a driver of net worth that allows you to pull value from that home and use it for key purposes. Even having affordable rental housing can be a driver of net worth. If you're not paying exorbitant amounts for your rental housing, that's more money that you have for other kinds of things, to save for emergencies, to put towards goals that you might have. So we have a set of three, what we call 10-year big, hairy, audacious goals that we work alongside Southern Bancorp Bank and Southern Bancorp Inc., also CDFIs that we were founded in partnership with about 30 years ago. We work together on these goals, and our housing goal is to empower 10,000 people with affordable housing. And so we're working on that all the time. We work through it through a number of ways. So you mentioned the housing and credit counseling. That's a really critical driver to help people make the decisions that they want to, that are going to be best for them, particularly long-term around housing, particularly if it's home purchase. That can be a huge purchase, sometimes the biggest purchase people make in their lives. So we make sure that's a good decision. Similarly, obviously, we're a CDFI, so we do lending. And so we do some mortgage lending as well, do affordable housing development lending. So we're thoughtful about those opportunities and trying again to ensure that the capital that we are providing access to is going into places that might not have access to capital otherwise, particularly rural areas, particularly areas where the housing quality might not be as good or the housing quantity might not be where it needs to be. We're also recognized that, everybody's not necessarily ready for a mortgage right away, or they may need some additional supports, that counseling offers that homebuyer education offers that support. We also have a small number of individual development accounts. So we've been able to continue to get some private and other funding to support these matched savings accounts. And in our version, typically people will save $1,000, they'll get a match of $2,000, and they can use that towards certain kinds of home-related purchases, things like buying a home. So it can be basically down payment assistance. But then they can also use it for home repair. And as I mentioned, that's a really critical issue. We often find people who, they may buy a home with us, maybe they'll get their mortgage through us to buy a home, but they know as soon as they buy that home, they're going to have home repair. So at the same time they're preparing to buy that home, they're also saving in an individual development account. So they have some additional monies to begin to make repairs on that home, or just bring it up to the standard that they would want for themselves and for their families. So we're glad to be able to offer those services as well. Part of what we find is that these are really important, particularly in areas where we work in. We're very intentionally in locations where there are not a lot of other banks. We're here to provide access to capital. And so we intentionally focus our efforts in places where there may not be a lot of access to capital, or at least affordable capital, because other banks may not have located there. So for us, what that means is that there's oftentimes a CRA, a bit of a CRA desert there, where there aren't a lot of institutions who have CRA assessment areas in the places where we work. So we are oftentimes trying to have conversations to figure out how we can partner with those organizations in different ways, because that CRA opportunity may not be there in quite the same way it might be as in a more dense area where you might have a number of banks that have assessment areas that overlap, and so you can provide those services. So I think that's something, obviously that's our issue, but I know that that's also an issue for a lot of other rural areas. They may not have significant CRA assessment areas that are relevant to a lot of banks.
Yeah, I'm glad that you brought up CRA, or the Community Reinvestment Act, which is legislation that was established in the 70s to address redlining and discriminatory lending. And currently, the Federal Reserve Board of Governors has an open advance notice of proposed rulemaking. So I would like to encourage folks on this session to submit comments, which are due by February 16th of 2021. And you can do that online or by email to help to ensure that the new Community Reinvestment Act meets the needs of the communities that it ought to. So I wanted to build on and turn to an issue that you briefly mentioned, which is racial equity. The Atlanta Fed is committed to racial equity and inclusion, and really thinking about it in the same way that you described, as something that is a barrier to economic mobility, particularly, kind of in the district that we serve. You probably have seen Dr. Raphael Bostic, our president CEO's essay on a moral and economic imperative to end racism, which correctly notes the historic, systemic, and structural barriers that racism has brought to our society and to our economy. And so currently, the Atlanta Fed is really listening and learning and intentionally putting a racial equity lens on the work that we do. And of course, this pandemic has brought this to light and made it a top concern. We see disproportionate impacts on communities of color, both in terms of the health impacts and the economic impacts as well. So currently, our community development program at the Atlanta Fed is working to understand, what does it mean to have an inclusive recovery coming out of this pandemic? We, rather than recreate or re-entrench some of the disparities that we see today and we saw prior to the pandemic, how can we create a society that is more equitable and not do as we have sort of after different other natural disasters or other shocks and recessions, develop policy that further widens these disparities. So we have launched a series on inclusive recovery, and there'll be a session on housing particularly, which should be in early 2021. And so, Karama, I wanted to turn to you and to get a little bit more of your perspective on what inclusivity means broadly to you, and are you thinking of it any differently in light of COVID-19 and the pandemic?
Yeah, it's an important question. And, we have at Southern have been really intentional, as I said, about thinking about diversity, equity, and inclusion, about thinking about that in a wide variety of our activities, right? So, that's not just hiring, but it's how we spend our money. It's how we lend. It's looking at our policies, our lending policies, and determining, are there ways we should restructure that so that we can still be safe, obviously be a safe lending institution, but can ensure that more people have access to capital. So there's just a variety of ways that we're looking at that and trying to improve our practices and our policies to ensure really that we meet the goal of why we were founded, which was really around this issue of racial economic equity. So when we think about right now, as you said, the pandemic, just similar to other kinds of situations, other kinds of disasters, public health or natural or otherwise, really exacerbates some of the issues of inequity that are already out there, right? It sort of brings to light things that many of us knew, maybe many of us didn't know, hadn't paid attention to, but it really sort of shows those inequities. And we're seeing a lot of that now. And so when I hear comments, we want to get back to normal, I think it's really just critical to remember that normal was not working, right? Normal was not a normal. If we think of normal as, 18 months ago, that was not a perfect time. There were a lot of existing inequities then that we're paying attention to now, but we don't need to get back to that. We need to actually improve upon that. And I think there are a lot of opportunities that come with developing these kinds of policies and practices and products that allow us to not re-entrench what was not working before for everyone, but develop new ways of working that are much more equitable, that allow more people to have more opportunity. And I think what's really critical there is you begin to grow the economic pie. I think sometimes it can be thought of as, there's a limited amount of resources and everybody takes from that. And certainly that's the case in some cases. But when we think broadly about how the economy has grown over time, as we've had greater participation in the economy, as more people can contribute who can contribute to their full extent, the economy grows with that. And that means it's a larger pie and everybody can benefit from that. And so I think as we move forward with it, that's really the mindset that we have as we go through this work around diversity, around equity and inclusion. And so, around housing in particular, I think there are a number of issues. We've seen housing challenges, in the past. We talked just now about, evictions, as we think about, orders to stay home or to self-quarantine in the home, it's important to recognize what home means for some folks. And that house might not be the safest place to be for any number of reasons, for mold issues or ability to exercise or just get out and do the kinds of things. People may not have broadband access that allows them to work from home or go to school from home or those kinds of things. So it's really critical as we think about, what housing means right now and what housing means going forward, how we can make those improvements. I think it's important to keep all of those pieces in mind. One of the things that I think, I'm thoughtful about personally, just sort of on my passion project is around heirs property. I know the Atlanta Fed has done some significant work on that as well. And thinking about how families who have land, may have a home on that land, how can they be better positioned to access the wealth in that land and make it a real viable asset for themselves and for their families.
Yeah, so Karama, you and I have connected quite a bit over the years over this topic, which is personally important to us. And of course, we see in the areas that we serve is a tremendous issue. If people aren't familiar with heirs property, it goes by several other names. It can be called family land or tangled title or clouded title property. But essentially, it's formed if someone owns property and they pass away without a will in place, or sometimes they leave a simple will that divides that property amongst their heirs equally. And this forms a very unstable form of land ownership, generally. Tenancy in common, it's called. So everyone has equal access to the property and an undivided interest. And it really can be vulnerable to things like interfamily disputes or sometimes third parties coming in and forcing a sale. And it's been a driver of land loss in many families for quite some time. I personally have heirs property in my family. It's in rural Wisconsin. Right now, there's, I think, only 9 heirs that own the property, but unfortunately, as generations pass on, the number of heirs will only exponentially increase. And again, that can lead to a lot of issues with how to how to make best use of the property, how to sell or dispose of the property, et cetera. And we do know that this is an acute issue in the rural South, particularly among Black families, and this has been one of the drivers of Black land loss, but it's also known to be pervasive in places like Appalachia among white families and the Colonias in Texas among Latinx families. So really a widespread issue. And Karama, you are the founder of the Heirs of Arkansas, a great organization, and recently penned an article on heir property issues and opportunities. So is there anything else you'd like to fill us in on the issues, and what are the opportunities as you see them?
Yeah, I think it's a really important issue, and we have worked together on these issues in the past, and it's always so nice to meet people who understand there's property and who have had it and or have it and are working around it. Particularly in rural areas, I think this is a real asset and an untapped resource, not just for individual families who might want to build something on the land or lease out the land or cut the timber on the land to the benefit of all the heirs, whether it's 9 in your case or because my great-great-grandfather bought his after he got out of slavery, a couple hundred on my side. That property can be a real value and a real asset, but you've got to have that title clear in order to do that. I think that particularly in rural areas, this is a real asset. There are families who have this property, who some of whom members don't even know that they are heirs to their property. And when I think about, I remember being in a conversation with someone, a group of people who were focused on asset building. And they were, really attentive to how people can build net worth, how people can increase their income, savings, those kinds of things. And really focused on that. And I mentioned to them this notion of property and land as an asset. And all the folks who were in the room, who were mostly on the coast and the northeastern part of the state and in California, just couldn't quite grasp what that meant because property is so expensive in the areas where they come from. It was not something that you would talk about in the context of low or moderate wealth families that land would be an asset. Because, high net worth families can't even own land in some of those places in some cases. So, but in a lot of rural areas where there is property, where property and land and housing is less expensive, as we talked about earlier, where there is generational property, where families have passed that property down. And even if folks don't live in it, they may be able to use it as an asset and contribute back to the economy in that way. It is really important to think about that and recognize what that asset is and find ways to unlock that value. I think a lot of times people talk about heirs property specifically with regard to the families. And obviously that's absolutely critical. The families are the ones that own the property and have the most availability to make use of it. But it is also critical for the larger community. So if you see, for example, a community of someone who has property that is underdeveloped, they're not being used, they may not be taxed at the same rate as property that is more developed, that has timber on it, or that has a newer home on it, or those kinds of things. When those tax rates go up, hopefully the family's obviously in a good position to pay those, but then that contributes to the larger community as well. They have a larger tax base with which to provide services for everyone in that community. In areas, and this is true in urban and rural areas as well, if you have property that oftentimes can be heirs property, that is dilapidated, for example. It's sort of the saying that when everyone has responsibility, no one has responsibility. So in the case of heirs property, sort of everybody has responsibility. And so who's going to fix the roof or repair the windows or those kinds of things? Well, as we find solutions for clearing title, for unlocking that value, not only do those properties increase in value, it's better for the whole neighborhood, for the neighbors, for the community at large. So I think really thinking about all those kinds of things is really critical. They're both policy and practice approaches. In Arkansas, I led an effort through the Heirs of Arkansas group to pass the Uniform Partition of Heirs Property Act. It's now been passed in 18 states and jurisdictions in the country, continuing to grow all the time. So there's some real energy and momentum around that. There's been some incentives written into the 2018 Farm Bill that really, frankly, incentivize states to pass the Uniform Partition of Heirs Property Act that really levels the playing field to help families keep their property if they want to keep it, not lose it if they don't want to lose it. So I think there's some real benefits there, some real opportunities, again, particularly in rural areas, that benefit not only families, but also the communities. And it's just a prime time to take advantage of that, particularly right now.
Yes, and I invite everyone, encourage you to check out Karama's piece, and we have some resources on our website too, that we've done often in partnership with a number of different organizations who are working on this topic of heirs property. So I did want to keep this positive kind of vibe going and end on an opportunistic or a note of opportunity. Are there any other opportunities that you would like to point to, particularly in light of the disruptions caused by COVID-19, that apply to rural areas and housing?
Yeah, and I think there's this, there really is an opportunity. It's sort of, this has been a extremely challenging time, for public health and other purposes, but there are some things that come out of it that I think we, should position ourselves well to take advantage of. I was just heard recently a radio article on NPR talking about trends in where people live. And they were talking about how there have been 100%, 150% increases in people moving from densely populated areas to less densely populated areas. The example they used that focused most of the story on was Burlington, Vermont, which has, I think, population of 43,000 people, which by some definitions counts as rural. And so, as people are thinking about, can I work from home? I think you and I are both in our homes right now. If people are able to work from home, if people have those options, they may be able to do that from anywhere. And so a lot of people are choosing and saying, you know what, I could live in this more dense area, or I could live someplace outside, have in some cases, maybe a better quality of life, depending on what their priorities are as a family. And still work and still, provide in the ways that I need to provide and be engaged professionally. And so I think we're seeing those trends happen. I was really pleased to see in that same article, they talked about Burlington, Vermont. They also talked about Little Rock, Arkansas, where I'm sitting right now as one of the top 10 places where people are relocating to from more densely populated areas. And there were a number of places across the country, some of them a little larger than others, but all of them, small or mid-sized cities. And there are people who are making those decisions. And so I think, it is a real opportunity for those communities, for the residents in those communities, their leadership, and for the people who are moving in to really re-envision what housing looks like, what home ownership looks like, what community looks like, in ways that are more equitable, in ways that provide more services for everybody. And so I think that, again, it is a real opportunity. I think we're ripe to capitalize on that really right now.
Fabulous. Fabulous closing words. Thank you so much. I totally agree, Karama. And we're grateful to the Housing Assistance Council for the work that they do to help move forward some of these ideas and opportunities. So again, thanks, Karama. Thanks, everyone, for tuning in. Thanks to the Housing Assistance Council for the invitation. Everyone be safe and enjoy the rest of this event.
Thank you all so much.